Hello, this is Willie from the Ozarks, and we are ready for lesson 70 in A Course in Miracles workbook for students. It is March the 11th, and our lesson today is My Salvation Comes From Me. My salvation comes from me. That's a statement that is... a lot of people would say that's somewhat of an arrogant statement, but the master is going to explain the importance that the problem and the solution are always together. So since we have our own problem, the answer's within us too. But we'll look at that here in just a moment. Yesterday's lesson 69, I trust you thought about it often, did your 10 or 15 minute meditation, which we're going to move into doing 2 of those after today. But we were also supposed to think about it often during the day. My grievances hide the light of the world in me. My grievances hide the light of the world in me. In the shorter practice periods, we're supposed to be telling ourselves this concept. Let me read it to you just as a last before we move on. My grievances hide the light of the world in me. I cannot see what I have hidden, yet I want to let it be revealed to me for my salvation and the salvation of the world. All right, so let's not hide the light of the world in us by having grievances. And when we do have the grievance, let's start noticing it and let it go. Apologize where it's useful, and by all means, don't return to the grievance. After you've noticed that you had the grievance, do everything you can to let it go and trust God and not rely on your own strength, the ego strength I'm referring to, obviously. Before we go on to our lesson today, my salvation comes from me. I've got a Italian parsley. This is a plain Italian parsley, and I don't think it's quite as cold hardy as the curly parsley, but it'll withstand a little bit of frost, and it has a lot of people confuse it with cilantro because of the broad leaf, more flat. But it has the distinct parsley flavor. All right. Okay. So let's go to my salvation comes from me. And I love this first sentence. We're going to stop and talk about it just for a moment. All temptation is nothing more than some form of the basic temptation not to believe the idea for today. My salvation comes from me. He says all temptation is nothing more than some form of the basic temptation not to believe that salvation comes from me. In other words, when you get upset with someone, you're thinking that their behavior is going to make you happy. That means you believe that their behavior and words are affecting you and going to bring you salvation, happiness. You can use that word happiness in place of salvation if it helps you and kind of get a better sense of what the Master's trying to get us to recognize when he uses this. At least I've found it to be true when I replace the word with happiness. It seems to play out. All temptation is nothing more than some form of the basic temptation not to believe the idea for today. My salvation comes from me. Salvation seems to come from anywhere except from you. So too does the source of guilt. You see neither guilt nor salvation as in your own mind and nowhere else. When you realize that all guilt is solely an invention of your mind, you must also realize that guilt and salvation must be in the same place. Understanding this, you are saved. Guilt and salvation are in your own mind. When you realize that all guilt is solely an invention of your mind, you must also realize that guilt and salvation must be in the same place. Understanding this, you are saved. Once you understand this, you're obviously going to choose happiness or salvation rather than guilt or depression, or what is he called it yesterday? A grievance. All right, paragraph 2. The seeming cost of accepting today's idea is this. It means that nothing outside yourself can save you. Nothing outside yourself can give you peace. But it also means that nothing outside yourself can hurt you or disturb your peace or upset you in any way. Wow. Puts it all back into where we are having some sort of a say in our disposition and our feelings. 3. Today's idea places you in charge of the universe. That's what I was trying to say. Today's idea places you in charge of the universe, where you belong, because of who you are. You're God's child. This is not a role which can be partially accepted, and you must surely begin to see that accepting it is salvation. It may not, however, be clear to you why the recognition that guilt is in your own mind entails the realization that salvation is there as well. Okay, may not be clear yet. I think he's going to help us make it more clear, though. 4. God would not have put the remedy for sickness where it cannot help. God would not have put the remedy for sickness where it cannot help. That is the way your mind has worked, but hardly his. He wants you to be healed, and so he has kept the source of healing where the need for healing lies. You have tried to do just the opposite, making every attempt, however distorted and fantastic it might be, to separate healing from the sickness for which it was intended, and thus keep the sickness. We've been looking for our happiness, our salvation in the clouds, instead of in our own mind where we share with Christ, with God. Now we're going to go through the clouds and back to our stillness, the blazing light, the inner light of God. Paragraph 5. Your purpose was to ensure that healing did not occur. What? Your purpose was to ensure that healing did not occur. God's purpose was to ensure that it did. Today we practice realizing that God's will and ours are really the same in this. Okay, so basically our ego has done everything it can to ensure that healing did not occur, because the ego, that's what gives the ego life. But God is a remedy. God wants us to be healed, and we do not really want to be sick because it makes us unhappy. Therefore, in accepting the idea for today, we are in agreement with God. He does not want us to be sick, neither do we. He wants us to be healed, so do we. My salvation comes from me. My happiness comes from me. It's all inside, right where God put it. Paragraph 7. We are ready for 2 longer practice periods today, each of which should last some 10 to 15 minutes. We will, however, still let you decide when to undertake them. We will follow this practice for a number of lessons, and it would again be well to decide in advance when would be a good time to lay aside for each of them and adhere to your own decision as closely as possible. I find it as soon as I get up in the morning to sit down and do my morning 10 or 15 minute meditation, or practice period as he calls it. And then again in the last, maybe hour before I go to bed, in the last little bit, I usually try to calm down and have my evening meditation. But he's saying at this point, pick whatever time you'd like. Paragraph 8. Begin these practice periods by repeating the idea for today, adding a statement signifying your recognition that salvation comes from nothing outside of you. You might put it this way: my salvation comes from me. It cannot come from anywhere else. My salvation comes from me. It cannot come from anywhere else. Now, he says you might put it this way. I'm realizing he wants us to get to the context, to the real, not just the form, the actual words. These are really good words, and I encourage you to at least memorize the titles. My salvation comes from me. But even that, and the rest of these italicized words, even if you do practice memorizing them, we really want to get the substance of the idea rather than the specific words, because there's a lot of different ways you can say the same thing, and that'll help you integrate it if you use different phrases. And that's what I think he's really wanting us to do. Paragraph 10. After we've said my salvation comes from me in our longer meditation, and then we put an associated word like it cannot come from anywhere else. My salvation comes from me. It's inside of me. My salvation comes from me. It's where God put it. Just some ideas like that. All right? Then, in paragraph 10, then devote a few minutes with your eyes closed to reviewing some of the external places where you have looked for salvation in the past. In other people, in possessions, in various situations and events, and in self-concepts which you sought to make real. Recognize that it was not there. Tell yourself, my salvation cannot come from any of these things. My salvation comes from me and only from me. Okay? And now let's look at that one more time, but we're going to use the word happiness instead of salvation so it can maybe make this a little clearer. With your eyes closed, then let's just read it again. Then devote a few minutes with your eyes closed to reviewing some of the external places where you've looked for happiness in the past. In other people, you've looked for happiness in other people. In possessions, you've looked for happiness. You've looked for it in various situations, in various events, in self-concepts which you sought to make real. That's where you were seeking salvation or happiness. Recognize that it was not there. Tell yourself, my happiness cannot come from any of these things. My happiness comes from me, and only from me. My salvation comes from me, and only from me. Paragraph 12. Now we will try again to reach the light in you. Remember the light we tried to reach through the clouds yesterday? We're going to try it again today. Remember the vast circle and the light, and that's your mind? And we were outside of our mind right now trying to find happiness in all the wrong places, as Abraham says. Esther Hicks speaks for him. So we're looking for it in all the wrong places. You cannot find it in the clouds that surround the light, and it is in them you have been looking for it. It is not there. It is past the clouds and in the light beyond. From the light beyond, from where our perspective outside our minds, it's through the clouds, beyond where we think we're at, to our true identity, ourself. Remember that you will have to go through the clouds before you can reach the light. Remember that you will have to go through the clouds before you can reach the light. But remember also that you have never found anything in the cloud patterns you imagined that endured or that you wanted. Nothing in the cloud patterns that endured or that you wanted. Paragraph 13. Since all illusions of salvation have failed you, surely you do not want to remain in the clouds looking vainly for idols there, when you could so easily walk into the light of real salvation. Try to pass the clouds by whatever means appeals to you. If it helps you, think of me holding your hand and leading you, and I assure you, this will be no idle fantasy. Okay, who's the me? Well, the Master Jesus is the source of this inspiring book. So imagine Jesus holding his hand and him leading you through those cloud patterns. And he says that I assure you, this will be no idle fantasy. Wow. Okay. To me, that gives me a lot of comfort to know that we can actually imagine in the clouds that Jesus is holding our hands and leading us through the maze, the confusion of his Son out of his mind, our Father, Son, our brother Jesus going to lead us back to our mind, to our Father. He says he'll do it. I assure you this will be no idle fantasy. And there, the last paragraph before for the short and frequent practice periods today, remind yourself that your salvation comes from you, and no one and nothing but your own thoughts can hamper your progress. For the short and frequent practice periods today, remind yourself that your salvation comes from you, and nothing but your own thoughts can hamper your progress. You are free from all external interference. You are free from all external interference. You are in charge of your happiness. I changed the words for you. You are in charge of your salvation. You are in charge of the salvation of the world. You are in charge of the happiness of the world. Remember, you're a son of God. Say then, my salvation comes from me. Nothing outside of me can hold me back. Within me is the world's salvation and my own. My happiness comes from me. Nothing outside of me can hold me back. Within me is the world's happiness and my own. And the way it's written one more time, instead of happiness, we'll use a word that's used. My salvation comes from me. Nothing outside of me can hold me back. Within me is the world's salvation and my own. So, we are going to devote our attention 2 times today to 10 to 15 minute extended practice period. You pick the times, but adhere to them. He wants us to adhere to those times as closely as possible. And you may need some flexibility. By all means, do them. Don't let the fact that you didn't do it at the time that you said you were going to do it keep you from going ahead and doing it. But do try to pick 2 times and adhere to them. All right? You might find that lunch break's a good time for you, or whatever, right before supper, or maybe right after breakfast, maybe right before breakfast. You pick the time, but stick to it. And let's one last time. My salvation comes from me. My salvation cannot come from any of these things. My salvation comes from me and only from me. And the one we're going to use repeatedly today, my salvation comes from me. Nothing outside of me can hold me back. Within me is the world's salvation and my own. So until tomorrow, say my happiness comes from me, or my salvation comes from me. Until tomorrow, peace.